Wow, everyone got quiet so quickly. Welcome. My name is Susan Farbstein. Along with Tyler Giannini sitting next to me, we co-direct the International Human Rights Clinic here at the law school. We're very excited to see so many familiar faces and a few new faces here for this Human Rights Advocacy workshop, which is our contribution to the bicentennial celebration. I'm going to do a quick roadmap of what we have planned, and then we're going to launch right in because we have now less than 2 hours to cover a lot of territory. So it's billed as a workshop for a reason. There are going to be some opportunities for all of you to interact with each other and with the panelists. We wanted to frame the workshop around challenges, so that's our plan. We're going to start off with sort of a mini panel discussion in which two of the folks sitting up here will talk about some of the challenges that they've confronted on a more kind of personal level in their own work. Then we're going to put a scenario to you and come back for a group discussion, and then we'll move on to our second panel that will look at challenges more at a movement level to the human rights movement with 3 of our panelists, and then there will be an opportunity for a little bit more engagement and discussion, and we hope to close on a positive note by talking about successes.
And the other piece of what we're trying to do today is give you a little bit of an insight into our approach to clinical education and clinical teaching. And so that's why we want it to be a workshop format where everyone is contributing. So hopefully that will be successful, given that we have 5 panelists who have an amazing diversity of experiences, and we're trying to do that. We'll see how successful we are, but that's the attempt. And we're all about experimentation, so you'll bear with us since this is an experiment, okay? The other thing is that we have to give an announcement that if you are not here or you thought you were coming to a session on teaching about lawyering for justice in the United States, that's in Jarvis' tent outside. Hopefully that will not cause a mass exodus, but everyone's staying put. Okay, good sign.
So we're going to jump right into our first panel. I'll introduce the 2 speakers. To my left is Thomas Becker. I feel kind of funny reading this official bio of you, Thomas, because what we did was we invited people who we wanted an excuse to see, so really we're lucky to have a bunch of friends with us on the panel today. But for those of you who don't know him, Thomas graduated in '08. He's an activist and a human rights attorney currently based in Bolivia. We've been lucky enough to work with him for the past decade plus on a lawsuit against the former president and minister of defense of Bolivia that I'm hoping Thomas will be speaking about at length. He's also done work in India, Lebanon, Israel, and Mexico, among other places. So he will go first, and then he will be followed by Chris Mburu, who earned his LLM in '93 from HLS. He's currently a senior human rights advisor at the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. He's worked on human rights, governance, democracy, peace, and conflict resolution issues for over 20 years across Africa and also in the United States. He also started the Hilde Back Education Fund, which is a charitable organization in Kenya that supports education of bright children from poor families. So, Thomas, we're going to kick it off with you.
We're going to kick it off with me.
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you. You know, I'm supposed to talk a little bit about myself, but I'd rather focus more on some of my friends in Bolivia who frankly, are changing the world, who are leading the struggle against impunity right now. You know, in 2003, the ex-president of Bolivia and his defense minister, Carlos Sanchez Goni, the ex-president, sent the military in to repress social movements, to repress protesters. And the result was hundreds of casualties of primarily indigenous Aymara Bolivians. And after the killings, you know, Goni, as he's known, fled to the United States with his defense minister and sought refuge here and have used the United States as refuge for the past 15 years, and they currently live here. So I was really fortunate to get to go to Bolivia before I started law school. And I met some of the people that were fighting to hold these people accountable. I met the victims, I met activists, I met lawyers, and they invited me to participate in their struggle against Ghani and against the defense minister. And when I started law school, I stayed in touch with these folks in Bolivia, and we talked about, how do we hold these people accountable? They're in the US, and we kind of explored this idea of, well, what if we brought a civil suit? At the time, I was a 1L. I returned during my 1L summer, and let's be real, I barely knew anything about the law. I don't even know if I know about the law now, but as a 1L, definitely not. So we talked about what if we could make this a project at the International Human Rights Clinic here at Harvard. So I remember calling Tyler. He was the first person I called, and I used one of these old phone booths that, there wasn't Skype at the time, so I'm showing my age. And I called Tyler, and I was like thinking, how do I convince this guy we need to try to take down a president? But immediately Tyler was like, let's do this. Let's see what we can do. And I remember thinking, like, either this guy's like the coolest professor ever or totally crazy. Probably both, frankly. And so, we started to build this case. And a year later, we submitted a complaint, and this lawsuit started moving forward. After I graduated, I moved down to Bolivia and have been fortunate to live there off and on for the last 10 years working on this trial with folks from Harvard, with a bunch of attorneys, but most importantly with folks in Bolivia who've really kind of led this struggle. Fortunately, this year, we actually finally made it to trial after a decade, after lots of legal obstacles. Just this spring, in March, we started. And this was a historical trial. This is the first time an ex-president actually had to sit before his accusers and respond for his human rights violations. So this was absolutely historical. But the thing that topped it, honestly, it took place a couple weeks ago when we had a verdict. And I remember like sitting in the courtroom and hearing the judge say, the two are responsible. And like, I lost it. I mean, I'm like, there's like two types of criers. There's like graceful criers, and then there's like ugly criers like me. So I'm just like bawling, and I'm looking around, and the rest of the lawyers were frankly just as bad. I mean, the whole team is just like bawling. But then I looked at my Bolivian friends who were sitting right next to me, who just smiled and were shaking their heads. Totally cool, way cooler than the rest of us. And they told me, because they knew all along the truth was on their side, but they were just glowing of pride knowing what they had just done. That this was the first time that a living ex-president has been held accountable for human rights violations in a US court. And these were Bolivians who, yeah, they're awesome. Theoretically, these are not the people that do that. They had been told their whole lives that they're poor indigenous peasants. They've been treated as second-class citizens. They've been excluded from the justice system, various justice systems. So, yet they were able to take down one of the most powerful, richest people in the history of the country, who was an ex-president. And they just shook their head because they knew what this meant, not only for impunity and the message it sent to leaders across the world, but also to social movements who've been organizing and victims of human rights abuses that you can be dispossessed and totally marginalized, yet you can actually do something about this. It was this incredible message, and they, as we're bawling, just sat there and kind of shook their head up and down. And so, obviously, it's been a pretty incredible experience to get to share this with them and folks here at Harvard and all the other attorneys that fought alongside the folks in Bolivia for years. I think part of why we were invited here was to talk about challenges that we've faced. And I started thinking through, and there's been a lot. I mean, ranging from, death threats, getting thrown in jail, working in war zones, things that you would think would be the bigger challenges. But the biggest challenges that I think I faced doing human rights law is figuring out what my role is as someone from the global north, particularly a white male. Like, where do I fall into this? How can I be a voice for marginalized communities without becoming the voice for marginalized communities? Something I've repeatedly seen is just where well-intentioned lawyers end up kind of co-opting this message or kind of stepping on struggles, where we innately, as lawyers, going to law school, we get a skill set, we learn a language that helps us litigate, that helps us write human rights reports, that helps us advocate for the communities that we work with that they don't have sometimes. And innate in that is that we're given this power to do things, but oftentimes, again, we become the voice too often. Particularly me, I find it troubling as a white male when I'm speaking for a community. that knows way better about what they need than I do. Part of the reason I'm bringing this up is because I'm frankly going through it right now in Bolivia, where we just won this trial. It's only been a few weeks, and it's been in the newspaper basically every day. And one of these narratives that keeps being repeated is gringo lawyer takes down president, or rock and roll lawyer takes down president. And it's quite frustrating because on one level, this has been a genuinely collective effort of many, many lawyers, many students, but most importantly, many Bolivians who frankly are leading this struggle. I mean, they're the ones who daily have to keep their wounds open, who don't get closure, that have to think about their 8-year-old daughter being shot in their home or their husband being shot in the head, and they don't get to move on. They keep these wounds open so that nobody has to suffer this again. And to me, that's the story that should be told. But unfortunately, sometimes there's this kind of white savior narrative that continually happens, where the white man comes down and helps poor communities that can't help themselves. And it's been real frustrating and hard to kind of push back on this. It's required, and frankly, I don't completely know what the answer is. You can't completely control the media, but what you can do is push back. You can talk to the communities and figure out what message they want out there. Explore with them how to respond to this, and be willing to change in the process. I mean, part of this has been a lot of reflection on what I've done to perpetuate this narrative, but also how do we change it? What do we need to do? This has not worked. What do we do now? So one of the things, for instance, we've been doing is I've required any interview I do now we require that one of the plaintiffs comes along and tells their story, so that instead it's their story that's in the newspaper, not rock and roll lawyer taking down president. I'm seeing that I'm fashionably over time, so I'll leave it at that, and perhaps we could explore this more, but I'll pass it on to the next speaker. Thanks.
Oh, I go straight? Yeah. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Mburu, and I'm very, very glad to be back here 25 years later. It seems like just yesterday. But within the last 25 years, I've been doing a variety of things, privately, with NGOs, but also with the United Nations. I've spent the bulk of my time working for the United Nations. And in all this, the work that we've been focusing on is human rights advocacy, trying to make sure that we can push certain messages, and we can try to advance the cause of human rights by through legal action, through training, through what we call in the United Nations technical cooperation, so that working with governments and trying to strengthen their mechanisms of improving human rights within the countries. So we have a lot of things in the toolbox. We don't just, we have the method of denouncing governments that commit human rights violations. That's number one, which is very open. We issue press releases, we issue public statements, the United Nations issues sanctions. So there's very serious advocacy that is very, very frontal. But then there's what we call the indirect advocacy, where we train advocates who are not part of the United Nations, and this is mainly the civil society. And we try to sort of prepare them for that role so that they can take on the government, because there are so many things that as the United Nations we cannot do, because we are essentially an organization of member states. So sometimes member states tell us, no, you can't go there. But we have a mandate as the United Nations Secretariat, and especially I represent the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is the agency entrusted with the promotion and protection of human rights around the world. It was started 25 years ago. It's one of the youngest agencies in the United Nations, but one of the most, most laden with the UN responsibility, because it's dealing with a big chunk of what the United Nations does. As you all know, the United Nations was created to work on 1, peace and security, 2, development, and 3, human rights. So we have a very, very clear mandate. And even when some of the times when the member states try to push back a little bit, we remind them that it is this is the 3 pillars of the United Nations that we are advancing. So most of the work that I've done is mainly, I've done legal activism and advocacy in Kenya because, as you know, in Africa, we've had many countries with dictatorships. We were not spared of that in Kenya. And so I was among the lawyers who were really pushing to bring change. And actually, and I know that you guys want to know how that's related to what I learned here. A lot of that I learned here because at the Human Rights Program, I was exposed to a lot of activists. At that time, Harvard was hosting a lot of dissidents, people who are trying to push for change in their countries through the use of the law. And I really learned a lot because we used to have, I actually did some part-time job here at that time, trying to organize those speakers. And I really got inspired. And I felt that if I went out there, I really wanted to do this. So that's very clear. So I did a lot of that activism in Kenya. But then the activism the advocacy that we've been doing in the United Nations, as I mentioned, strengthening the civil society advocates. Civil society advocates in Africa and in other parts of the world are facing real danger. They get killed, they get persecuted, they get banished out of the country, they get all sorts of persecution. And so protecting them is a huge responsibility of anybody who deals with human rights. So as the United Nations, part of my mandate, right now I'm the representative of the United Nations human rights in Rwanda. And you all know what happened in Rwanda. Actually today, we're having a ceremony in the United Nations to mark 24 years since the genocide. So Rwanda is coming out of that, but it's still facing some issues where human rights are active and they need to pass on very important messages to the government, and they need to be supported because a lot of the times the governments push back. In Rwanda, they're not really persecuting them blatantly, but in other countries, like in my own country, in Kenya, we've had serious, blatant persecution. In Congo, we've had civil society leaders disappear. One of my very good friends, a guy called Floribert Chibert in Congo, was murdered after he had issued a statement against the head of the police in the Congo on human rights violations. So these are the kind of things that we are dealing with. We are dealing with real life issues. And a lot of the time, because I'm sitting out there, wearing a tie and looking very serious, representing the United Nations, I may not be able to go out there with a placard, telling the government that this should not happen, but we have methods by which we tell the government that this must stop, and we put the government to account, and we put judicial procedures. And obviously, as you all know, we have now the International Criminal Court, which has become a very important platform for trying perpetrators of mass human rights violations. But we also support a lot of my work and my budget in Rwanda. I use it to support frontline advocates who go out there and do the placards, who go out there and do the challenging of the government, who do the picketing, who go out there and challenge these governments. We also train judges, and we also train the legal personnel so that the judges can also be sensitized about human rights issues, so that when these issues come to their courts, they are able to deal with them. And they're able to cite international law as the basis of their judgments. As you know, judges cannot just rule out of an emotion. They have to base it on the law. So we train the judges so that when they're dealing with these issues, they can base it on the law. We also push governments to implement their international obligations. All these governments, even where all these human rights violations are occurring, have pledged to be part of the international human rights legal system. And that is what makes the human rights violations perpetrated by the government so awful. It is because these same governments have ratified all the international treaties that talk about the protection of human rights. And then we also, sometimes I find myself advocating among the UN agencies, inside the house. Sometimes we have UNICEF, all the other World Health Organizations that are not UN, that are not human rights. But they do not understand that everything that they do is supposed to promote human rights. So, for example, in Rwanda, what I have done is I have prepared this handbook to be used by the United Nations agencies on how they should incorporate human rights principles in all that they do. Because we sometimes get these bureaucrats coming into the UN and thinking, well, my work is just to distribute food. What does human rights have to do with that? But we have to remind them that there are all these issues of equality, access to that food, non-discrimination, all the principles that are promoted by human rights. And then finally, in my own private capacity, because I just felt that, working within the United Nations is, it's good, but it's not enough. I started my own foundation in Kenya. It's called the Hilda Back Education Fund. And the reason I started that Hilda Back Education Fund is because many years ago, several decades ago, when I was growing up in Kenya, I did not have a hope for education. And then a woman from Sweden by the name of Hilda Back came and supported my education. So I decided to start a foundation in her name, and it's called the Hilda Back Education Fund. And the work that I do in that foundation is mainly to advocate for education as a human right. And what we're trying to say is all children. I came to Harvard. I ended up at Harvard, but I was very, very lucky. Most of the kids in my generation did not make it because education was not free, and all of them could not pay for it. And now what I'm trying to do, and I do a lot of runs around the world, and I'll be running today around here at Harvard, exposing my message, education is a human right, which I have right here. Which I happen to have right here. Education, you can see it later. Not Superman. So anyway, that is for later, because in advocacy and activism, you have to use all the tools at your disposal. All right, and that's what I want, especially the young people here and the people who you guys are training now. Tell them you gotta use all the tricks in the book, because the governments are using all the tricks in the book to suppress human rights, and that's the whole point. And finally, now on the challenge, the main challenge is, one, endangering the security of those we support. That has been a big challenge for me. Sometimes I get overexcited, and sometimes you engage all these advocates and activists, and then they fall in trouble. For example, in Congo, when I was working in the Congo, we worked with a group of lawyers, and we were training them, and we were showing them how to do the activism, and then we realized that as internationals and non-Congolese, I'm from Kenya, the government could not touch us, but the locals were not as safe as we were. And we woke up one morning, and they had been put in detention. And so you have to be very careful. That's a big challenge. You have to be very careful not to expose people to danger, because you don't want anybody dying. You do not want anybody being persecuted. And what we did, but then you also have to use strategies. We went to the embassies. We went to the French embassy. We went to the Japanese embassy and the United States embassy. And we convinced them to talk to the government to release those activists to the embassies. So the activists were released to the embassies, and the government said, we're only releasing them on condition that they don't remain in this country. And so those activists were taken as exiles in France and some in the United States. Some have ended up going back. But that's to show you the kind of live challenges that we deal with. The last thing I want to mention, which is very, very important, is that we are facing an international human rights backlash. And this is mainly happening in the rise, through the rise of right-wing governments. A lot of human rights are being violated more blatantly than they were 25 years ago, which is very, very dispiriting for some of us who have been in this movement, because we are seeing a rollback. We are seeing, you know, in countries in Europe and in other countries that I will not mention here, you're seeing a lot of rollback where human rights activists and advocates are in more danger than they were. You're seeing areas where the political space is closing, the civic space is shrinking, and this is where we need even more advocacy. And that is what I hope we can have a discussion on now and in the future. Thank you.
So Chris and Thomas have teed up some of the key things that are the personal challenges, from the life-threatening security situations that advocates face every day, to the role of the global north. It's interesting that both of those don't necessarily pop off the page as legal issues. And often what we're dealing with in clinics and practice is, we know the law. You're obviously not allowed to crack down and kill people that are doing human rights defense work. And so it becomes about judgment calls on how do you engage. That's a lot of what Chris and Thomas are teeing up as the personal challenges. So we're going to pivot to a scenario. And so we'd like groups of 3 or 2, however is your neighbor. And this is kind of an example of one of the things that we do in the clinic quite regularly, is try to get teams of people. It's normally not one individual that's making a judgment call, to focus in on making judgment calls. The law is in the background. You obviously need to know the law when you're making these judgment calls, but a lot of these are ethical dilemmas. And so we'd like you to spend 10 minutes talking to your neighbors, friends, colleagues. Some of you have been colleagues for years. We can see the laughing and smiling in the room, so hopefully that will continue. We're also going to have a discussion up here with each other. We'll turn off the mics. And then at the end of the 10 minutes, come back. We'd like you to have then a discussion with the panel, Chris, Thomas, anybody can participate at that point, about things that have come up from the scenario, but also from what Chris and Thomas raised. And then we'll wrap up the personal challenges piece, and we'll pivot to the movement challenges, which Chris, I think, has teed up quite nicely as one of the key things to talk about in the second hour.
Okay, I think we're going to call people back together. We should say that when we use this scenario in a class setting, we usually take about an hour to work through it. So we understand that we're cutting people short. But hopefully it gives you sort of a window into the way that we try to present problems and challenges to students and get them to start grappling with it. Given the limited time, rather than having different teams report back about sort of what you decided or what you thought, we thought that it might be interesting for you to sort of ask questions of the panel if there were things about the scenario that you found particularly sticky or confusing, or you didn't know how you would handle it. We thought that we would move the conversation that way. So we'd love to hear from groups about places in the scenario that you felt really stuck.
Hi. One thing Valentina and I discussed, which has happened to both of us in different contexts, is if you sometimes help someone, we feel like they might feel pressured to give you information, and like how playing that role as a lawyer can be very difficult to handle. Like, we don't want people to feel pressured, like they have to help you because you help them.
Maybe we'll just take a few and then we can let whoever wants to respond, or there are others.
I'll say, one thing that stuck out to me is that this person had one contact, or seemed to have one local contact. I would say you should have
So why are you working here if you only know one other contact? Fair.
I guess one concern that we had was that since this is a camp of what seems to be refugees, if you help this one child, there might be other children who expect the same thing. And before you know it, like there's like some substantial mission creep that you're here to do reporting, but now you're just transporting children from one part of the country to the other, which wasn't part of the mandate. It might not be within your expertise.
I think one of the things that we're concerned about is what is the individual's particular situation right now? Is she in significant danger of being ill or seriously whatever? And that would influence at least the decision that we would make.
And just along those lines, what's the, it seems to stimulate the interest in determining before we go in, what's the impact? What's the impact going to be on these people for having to tell their stories of trauma, and how do we best take care of them in exchange for what they're giving to us?
Great. Yeah, Michael.
And I think the other thing was about sustainability. So if you're removing this child, is that really in the child's best interest, and are you able to ensure that a safe environment can be sustainable for the child?
I think I saw.
What comes to my mind is a question of boundaries. And it shows up in a variety of contexts. It's not limited to the one described or even this part of the park. It shows up in conventional law practice. It shows up in the provision of medical services. If we're in a helping profession, it's inevitable. I mean, you wouldn't be doing this kind of work if you, on a certain level, weren't a people person. And yet, you're advancing institutional causes. Those are going to be in tension. And I'll say, charitable impulse or the protective impulse may actually be in tension with clear thinking on your reason for being.
And I think we don't really know completely what the mission is, but I think one needs to think about, are you endangering your mission by stepping out of bounds and helping this young woman? So you have to think about the larger picture. Why are you there? What is your purpose? And are you going to put that in danger by helping a specific person?
Great. So obviously this room has identified a lot of issues that are embedded in this one little paragraph. I think what I'll do is just turn to the panelists and see who kind of wants to respond to any of the things that have been put to us, or if there were other things that we all talked about that you wanted to raise in terms of how you begin to answer these really difficult questions.
And I can jump on to piggyback up what you said in terms of endangering the mission. I think another question is how does it endanger potentially this young girl or the communities that you're working with? I mean, particularly as an outsider kind of parachuting in from Human Rights Watch, I don't know how to answer these questions. I think the first thing you have to do is talk to your local contacts and the communities there to gauge what this means. I mean, if we take this woman out, or young girl out, does this, does she come back? Is this a temporary situation that she's in this community? Will she be able to come back if she wants to? Are we perpetuating, I mean, how is it going to look if some outsider, gringo, takes some child? What does that mean for the other people in the community? I mean, I think it could potentially endanger a lot of people, and I wouldn't know how to answer, based on this single paragraph, I wouldn't know how to answer the question, and I think you need to look to people on the ground who know the community and know the situation better than someone who's come from the outside to analyze this.
This is a very interesting scenario, and I really think it's a very, very important mind jogger for all of us. For me, I've dealt with all these issues. As I alluded in the past, we've actually rescued activists, specific activists out of danger, and ferried them out of the country through the help of the embassies. And there were some questions: why are you doing that to those? What about the others left behind? There are always these questions. But when you're in the field dealing with these issues, you have to take razor-sharp decisions based on individual cases. There are certain cases you look at and you say, no, I am intervening here, and I'm going to deal with it. However, there are a lot of things that we are cautioned about. One, do not be a Rambo. Do not think that you can do everything. Try to use existing services. In a lot of these countries, there are a lot of services that would actually work better for the interest of this girl or the source that you're dealing with. You're not a policeman. There are police officers that you can talk to about, the perpetration of a criminal case, criminal act, or the ongoing endangerment of the girl. Contacts you have as a human rights advocate, as a human rights activist, and if you're a researcher, you need serious contacts on the ground. And so, by the way, sometimes by virtue of just being seen with a girl, you've already put her in danger. So sometimes you actually have to talk to the girl, but then disengage from that. But you're not really abandoning her. You have set in motion a barrage of interventions through your contacts. And we've done a lot of this. When we went to Ethiopia, and the government would not let us deal with any of the dissidents, we would go to talk to the dissidents, but then we would not, we would just have a casual conversation. How is your situation? We would not even carry notes because the government would take the notes away from us. But then, based on what we heard, we would get the relevant, some NGO, some local NGO, some local chief, some local women's rights activist or lawyer deal with that. And then we would fly back to London, the Secretariat of Amnesty International, and just wait for the information to come. And the interventions that we left behind would be successful. So that's very important. However, when you are dealing with a source, in human rights advocacy, for you to have advocacy, you need data. You need information. So when you have a source that is giving you credible information, you need to find out how to get that information, because if you ever write a report, you're going to be lambasted if the report is not credible. So in terms of human rights collection, obviously the most important thing is what we call the primary source. This girl is a primary source. She's a victim. That's a primary source. Then there's the secondary source where you hear from her father saying this is what happened to my daughter. Then there are even more post-secondary sources where an NGO tells you a report was brought to us and this is what happened. So when you are in front of a primary source, you are in front of a treasure trove of information that will give your report in the future a lot of credibility. So you have to be very careful about how you deal with that without endangering, but at the same time making sure you collect every little data that comes out of that. That's second. Third, we have what we call the do no harm policy. It's very, very important. My friend Viviana has been working a lot on these issues in other parts of the world, and she knows that very well. So make sure whatever intervention you have, human rights is about protection. You have to have that at the foremost objective, that you are out there to protect. If you endanger, then you're doing harm. So you have to make sure that that balancing is done. So that do harm do no harm policy is very important. Then the other thing we always cautioned about is not being tempted to buy information or to just to create an incentive to have information. In human rights, what we have found, if you want information, you'll get it. But that goes either way. If you want bad information, you'll get bad information. You'll go there and say, anybody who tells me how many people are raped here will get $100. You'll get, 100 rape allegations. So you have to be careful about what you dangle in front of, especially the victims. So you have to let them tell their stories. Let them come from the heart. You should not be prodding, and you should not be obviously buying information. I was troubled a bit about this whole arrangement where he's trying to get the housing done and all this thing, because that's creating an incentive. And in a situation like that, you'll have somebody who was not a victim tell you it happened, because they think that that is your mandate. So we have to be very careful about that. And finally, there are two forms. Always remember, there are two forms of danger. Danger to you as a human rights advocate and fact finder, and danger to the source. So again, you have to counterbalance that. There are times I was in Eritrea, and we found women who had been attacked in a raid, and they were sitting there, and we needed to help them, and it was getting late, and we had to make some decisions, and we decided that we were going to look for services. But the team behind us decided that it was going to take these women in their vehicle and bring them to Addis Ababa. But then, because those women were there, the convoy fell under an attack. So these people endangered themselves and endangered the security of the sources. So those are some of the dynamics that you really have to watch when you're looking at these issues.
So Thomas and Chris already gave a lot of important tips. For me, it's just, so taking all of those and the questions that you raised, what helps orient my instincts in a situation like this is really seeing myself and my organization as part of an ecosystem. It's not even just having contacts. It's really understanding your role and the fact that you're part of an ecosystem of actors as a human rights advocate. Meaning, if I were in that situation, I wouldn't feel like, what do I have to do? No, like, what does the entire ecosystem have to offer? Who do I know that can provide this emergency support, ensuring long-term safety and sustainability, who can provide psychosocial support to the girl at that moment? I don't have to do it all. Perhaps I won't end up doing any of those services at all. At the end of the day, it's really connecting the person to the different parts of the ecosystem. And I think that relieves a lot of the pressure or the guilt even that Thomas referred to, like, what do I have to do as Human Rights Watch, as this white male going into this? But all of us, whether white male from the north or female from the south or working at the UN, it's part of an ecosystem, and it's part of our obligation when we go out there to make the effort, aside from doing the day-to-day job of doing research, litigation, of really getting to know who's out there, who can help the different causes that I'm working on. So in our case, so I'm based in Bogota, in Colombia, and we work with Venezuelan activists and non-activists who are crossing the border and trying to cross the border. So the question of sustainability, when you help one person, where do you then, stop? Because we're not an emergency support organization, but we know people who do that. We've partnered with organizations that provide emergency support. Someone who will then, we're developing this protocol. We were just with some Venezuelan activists again last week, and they were saying, so if I have to leave next week, tell me where the step-by-step that you can offer from the moment I cross the border in Cucuta into Colombia. So we're like, okay, when you come, we call this person who's not from our organization. There are organizations that provide emergency support, even funds and housing. And that's what they're trained to do. And I wouldn't even dare doing something when I know I'm not trained for that. So it's really, the word for me is ecosystem. I'm part of an ecosystem.
Okay. So I think we're not going to sort of answer all of the questions that were put out on this scenario. Hopefully it gives you an indication of the way that we would try to talk with our students and make them see, make them understand how complicated it is. I think part of what I'm hearing, one of the themes that came out, is how as advocates, as human rights attorneys, of course we have agency, we have a role to play, but we also have to be very mindful of this do no harm principle, that as soon as you insert yourself into a situation, you've changed it in some way by virtue of being there. And maybe you're changing it for the better, but you have to be so mindful of the fact that by virtue of showing up at this informal camp, by virtue of having this conversation, expectations may change, realities may change, so that even if you're very, very thoughtful about the role that you're playing, there's a danger, there's a risk in what you're doing. I think we're going to pivot now to our second panel, so I'm going to let Tyler introduce that one and talk more about movement challenges.
And just one reflection that also came out, I think, for me in listening was that a lot of the dilemmas that were identified, the questions, they can't really be reconciled. And so you have this duality often between like the institutional mission and the humanity of the person in front of you. And that sometimes can't be reconciled. So maybe the ecosystem works, but sometimes if you're in an urgent situation, maybe you're not tapped into that because it's a war zone that's just come up and the ecosystem is not well developed. So part of this, for this, hopefully the discussion is so that when that moment comes, and we've all experienced it in our practice, some variation on this, you're not surprised by it, so you can make that decision and not be paralyzed. And that's, I think, hopefully the big thing that comes out of our classrooms is be ready to make those decisions and not be surprised by them. The movement challenges are, we'll see if those are going to be any easier. Let's see where we go. So we're going to have Meghan and Sam and Kriz give us their insights on the challenges. I'm going to keep the introductions brief. We could go quite long with those, but because we want to move forward with to hear from them, let me keep this. Meghan, I'm going to start with you. Okay. And Meghan is currently a postdoctoral fellow in law and inequality. That is a great postdoc with the American Bar Foundation. I think we have to give a shout out. You just finished your dissertation last month. So congratulations on that. So she has a PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago, also a JD from this law school, and an MA from Fletcher. So many degrees, and a lot of different angles on things. The work that she's focused on right now is the role of law in war and peacemaking, with a particular emphasis on property over land. And she has a book project right now called Property in the Shadow of Post-Conflict Colombia. It's an interdisciplinary study examining how property can become understood in both the root of violent conflict and the key to peace. So that's a little bit of insight into one of the things she's doing. There's a long history of work that she's done that I'm leaving out, but maybe you'll touch on some of that as you get into movement. Let me introduce Sam and Kriz briefly too, so that we can keep the conversation going and just move through. Sam is next to Meghan, and she is currently the Health Policy Leadership Fellow at the Satcher Health Leadership Institute at Morehouse School of Medicine. She's also a graduate of this law school, same year as Meghan. That's a good year, and Thomas. So that's a decade ago. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. But I did. I'm older than that, so I think I'm allowed to do that. And while here, she worked on a variety of things through the clinic, so that's where our relationship dates to that experience. She's maintained a long commitment to a range of domestic and international issues, so I'm hoping that Sam's going to be able to touch on some of the domestic dimensions of rights and social justice issues. She's been looking at human rights and the nexus between the rule of law and meeting human needs. And during her time as a practitioner and lawyer, she's worked on housing, food assistance in New York and South Florida. She's worked with paralegals challenging sexual violence in rural Sierra Leone. And she's also been engaged with South African health workers, addressing the legal and ethical challenges faced by patients living with HIV/AIDS. In her current work, she's looking at the issue of health more closely, and I hope that she'll be able to expand on this domestic and social needs from a different dimension than some of the things we've heard so far. And then Kriz, you've introduced yourself a little bit, but there's more to your background. She's the research coordinator at De Justicia in Bogota, and she has an LLM from this law school and a JD from, I'm gonna mess up the pronunciation. Ateneo in Manila at the University of Philippines. Kriz, after graduating from here, did a fellowship with the Open Society Foundation in New York, and she's been a lecturer in the Philippines. She's also worked with other Asian organizations on access to justice issues, and she's also worked in Cambodia and Uganda. Currently, she is doing a lot of experimental work with methods on how you actually bring collective knowledge and new approaches to labs and scenario-based learning to problem solving for human rights issues. She's closely working on issues related to the closing of space of civil society and solidarity support for human rights defenders in the global south. Again, there's much more I could say, but I'll leave it at that so that we can hear from other people besides myself. So Meghan, I'm gonna put you on the spot and have you start.
All right, I thought it was at the end. It's a total pleasure to be here in this room with all of you. Thank you so much for having me here. It's just so special. It reminds me how special it was to be here and to learn from everyone that I had the pleasure to learn from when I was here, so thank you. And you know, challenges to the movement, I think you use the word tension and kind of duality in your wrap up of the last panel, and that is kind of how I was thinking of it, because I think some of the challenges to the movement, at least for me, are really old ones that don't go away, that, you know, that history keeps repeating itself. And I sort of thought of three that I think are really critical, that kind of are old, but that they crop up in new ways. And one of them Thomas touched upon in the first panel, which is, you know, this real tension between legal advocacy and organizing, that at their best can really support each other, but at their worst can work at counter purposes. And I'll tell a little story about this that I think will help lead into the second tension as well. And that is, as many of you may know, and I know some of you know very deeply in this room, Colombia just went through a long peace process to sign a peace agreement with the FARC guerrillas, which they signed in 2016. And during the organizing around peace, what was really interesting and to me very disturbing was the fact that many prominent international human rights organizations spoke out against the peace process, and on the basis of the idea that it would foster impunity. And this is, you know, a sense of, and this is from international human rights organizations, but also some other ones in Latin America who had worked really hard for many years to build a transitional justice framework that would adequately bring accountability for dictatorships in the Southern Cone, for example, and then around the world, really, in the transitional justice scenarios that played out after that. And so there was such a devotion to this body of law, which was very fragile, very difficult to win, but unfortunately at the great cost, I think, of seeing the bigger picture of what people organizing around peace are trying to do, which is bring an end to a 60-year civil war. And that tension between, you know, what legal advocates really thought was important, which is like protecting a fragile body of law that had been difficult to win, against a broader notion of justice or peace that wasn't just about, accountability in the form of prison sentences was really, really difficult to resolve. And I saw this from the very micro interactions of, Argentine lawyers and Colombian organizers and lawyers to official statements by major international human rights organizations executives. So I think that's a tension that's really hard to resolve, and leads into a second tension that I'd like to talk about, which is that between this kind of notion of accountability and notions of justice or peace that we might have. And I think in domestic situations, we're really seeing this play out a lot with really important moves towards pushing for accountability for people in power on many fronts, from police officers who disproportionately execute violence against people of color to business executives who make decisions that are really detrimental to the health of people and the planet. And those movements, I think, are really, really important. And in many of these situations, what's justice for folks who are affected might indeed be, accountability in the form of incarceration. But what does that mean for broader movements of ways we might think about justice, for the push against mass incarceration, for the push against accountability as understood as prison sentences, which I think are really, really important movements right now as well. Like, how do we think about those things together? And those are really hard to sit with. How do we move away from the carceral state and also ask for a kind of justice that's real and that affects the kind of power imbalances that we have? I think that is a tension that's really, really hard to deal with, and that we, as human rights advocates, should be in a position of sitting with and thinking about every day, And then finally, the third one is one, that the great work that this clinic has done, I think, really shows and has really been pushing on for a long time, which is the very long division between, civil and political rights and economic and social rights, how hard it is to work for change that actually asks for structural economic change, right? Just how difficult that is. To get living wages, to get environmental protection, to get healthcare, clean water in our own country and other countries, compared to doing work around civil and political rights. I think it's really striking how hard it has been for how long. So those are three tensions that I think are really important, and we're also asked to kind of think about how clinical education can address these. And I mean, from my personal standpoint, the education I got in this clinic was fundamental, and especially thanks to the clinic and especially to Tyler, fundamental for being able to kind of even think about these tensions, to recognize them as tensions, as not as something that has clear answers. And I think that's a really hard thing for law students to grasp, and very important for clinics to do is, and I think Tyler and Susan have raised this with scenarios and in other settings, is to say, there aren't clear answers. Law students really like clear answers, as you guys all know. And I think it's just a clinic's role to show them that in the real world there aren't very many. There aren't very many clear answers, and there aren't very many good solutions, and there are very few victories, and that to do the work still, that the work's still important, even though you might not have something that looks really clean and crisp and clear at the end. And I think another really important thing for clinics to do is something that I think all of you raised, and that was raised on the panel by several of you, is just to be good listeners to movements, to be critical thinkers, and to listen to people as to what they think might be a good or a bad strategy. What's a failure or what's a victory might look really different to someone that you're working with than it does to you at the outset. So to really just listen hard, I think, is a really good lesson that this clinic teaches. I think is very important the clinics teach. And then finally, yes, to make judgments based on the law, but also to make judgments on the basis of a sense of justice, your own sense of justice, but also our sense of justice, but also the sense of justice that the movements and people that we're working with might have, which might be very different from our own, and that might be unclear at the beginning, but is figure-outable often. And that sometimes may put law students in the very uncomfortable position of having to push, instead of push for law or push to build it, push to break it down, push to change it, and push against compliance with a legal standard, as in the case of Columbia. I mean, I think that was the right thing to do, was to say, yes, we have a body of law that was very hard to win, but no, we're going to do something different here, because that's important for our broader sense of justice. So I think that's hard when you're in a law school, as many students think that we're here to learn the law. I remember so many times, one a year in those classes where they'd be like, but what's the law? Students. And, when the question becomes, well, what do we do with it because it's not doing what we need it to do? I think is a hard one. So those are things that I think this clinic taught me to see, and that I think is really important for us to think about in terms of these broader tensions in the movement.
Thank you, Meghan. We'll come back to the things that you've raised, and there'll be some question and discussion. Sam, hopefully you can build off of Meghan's thoughts and add some new dimensions to this. So.
Hi, everyone. Thanks to Susan and Tyler and everyone at the Human Rights Clinic for inviting me back. I actually became a student at Harvard Law School because I wanted to work in the Human Rights Clinic, and I'm not even exaggerating about that. So, and that's exactly what I did for much of my time here, and it was a really important experience to me, so I'm grateful to have had it, and I'm grateful to be back. I just, like Meghan, I had three thoughts I wanted to share, and then I wanted to touch very briefly on my clinical experience. And, some of what I say is going to overlap with what several people on the panel have already said. So forgive me if I'm a little redundant, but I think it's a testament to sort of where we are in the current moment, both in terms of being able to look back and recognize the ways that the human rights movement, which is now, in its sort of 60s and has been, really critical to refashioning our world in good and bad ways, still presents some of the same problems over and over again, and challenges us to kind of think critically and do some of this work in new and creative ways. So the first thought I had was, or the first sort of tension or challenge that I thought of was that, there's a question about the role of modern human rights, which privileges and really relies upon and is undergirded by democratic norms and principles at a time when democracy and its various elements are under siege, being called into question, being undermined in many ways, even in sort of the long-standing democracies. I raise that, and that is all I'm going to do, because it's very much an open question, and I think opens a large debate that I myself am not even sure how to begin to crack, but I do sort of feel like it may become the prevailing question for us. I mean, people do human rights work in places that are not democratic, and people on the ground, local activists, local people engage in really important, really critical, transformative human rights work in places where democracy doesn't function very well or even exist. So my point is not that you need democracy for human rights, but we are sort of, as practitioners here in the global north in places like Harvard, are sort of guided by the idea that ultimately we're trying to get good constitutions and good legal norms and entrench the rule of law And what happens when those things just become a joke, right? Or treated as a joke by people in positions of power. So that's, I hope people will have some insights about that or comments about that. The next thought I had concerned sort of human rights, the tension actually that Meghan alluded to, and well, not just alluded to, but really engaged with, surrounding sort of, civil and political rights versus economic and social rights. This long-standing battle between the two. What does it mean that the large human rights institutions, both the private institutions and also public institutions, have really privileged civil and political rights? Because frankly, we haven't figured out a way to talk constructively and practically about how to create systems where we pursue and achieve not just economic equality, but real equity, where we invest in developing humans and improving people's circumstances based on where they are, meeting people where they are. And I think that question becomes more acute as, the sort of post-World War II social contract that many of the sort of modern northern democracies invested in, were creating the creation of welfare states and the creation of tax systems that resulted in public investments. That social contract is also under siege, right? And that has not always worked for many people living in these societies, but now the vast majority of people are finding that that social contract is not living up to its promise, and again is not only being called into question but undermined. And so, what does the human rights movement offer, both in a rhetorical sense, in terms of the language we use, in terms of the language we develop to advocate around economic and social issues, but also in terms of the infrastructure that we create? What kind of systems do we create to actually improve people's living conditions? That question has been very acute for me, and one of the reasons why I have been sort of tormented as someone who feels very emotionally invested in human rights principles, because I have worked in places like Sierra Leone, which sort of exists at the bottom of, or close to the bottom of the World Index on Human Development. And I have also worked in very poor places in the United States, right? And a lot of us have that experience of sort of grappling with the tension of what does it mean that there are people living in our rich country who are as poor as, or whose life outcomes are actually as bad as those of people living in much poorer places. And where is the language for that? On what basis do we advocate around that? And I think that question is going to continue to confront the human rights movement. It has from the beginning, and that's not going to go away, and I think it's going to become even more acute as economic inequality and the shortage of a language around equity becomes even more deeply entrenched in our world as the gap between the rich and the poor grows. And then the last thought I had is very personal for me because I've struggled with how to sort of frame this. There's a question about sort of what kind of role the modern human rights movement can play in bridging the divisions that exist among movements. So, for example, as a person of African descent, I live in a country where people of African descent are at a sort of broad level or statistically speaking, their health outcomes, economic outcomes are really terrible, actually, as compared to the rest of the people living in this country. Well, actually, no, that's not totally accurate, but as compared to many other people living in this country. And so recognizing that, sort of what it means to attempt to pursue racial justice in the United States, but then to think about racial justice and economic justice outside of the United States, and to be able to recognize that there are actually really deep-seated connections between these justice movements, and to be able to articulate that, I have found that that's been a challenge, and I think it will continue to be a challenge, again, because we have social movements that are developing where people from the Global South, also due to, like the rise in social media and people being able to get their voices out, or sort of being able to articulate that there's a huge racial component to disparity, and the disparity that exists between the global and North and South, but that there are actually connections between what happens among social movements in the United States and what happens among social movements in places like sub-Saharan Africa or the Indian subcontinent or Latin America. And I'm not sure that the human rights movement has figured out ways of being able to articulate what some of those connections are, and to be able to create a space where we can actually frame, say, policing issues or disproportionate lack of access to health care among Native populations or among African American populations in the United States as being human rights issues in the way that we are able to frame sort of violence that takes place in Syria or Congo as being human rights issues. And I think that again is sort of a rhetorical challenge, but it's also an ethical and a legal challenge and a policy challenge that I think I think that, again, the human rights movement has sort of grappled with since its inception, and that's not going to change. And that's okay, because these kinds of movements and making change and changing our world is a dynamic thing, and we were talking yesterday about the idea that progress is something that, we think we've come very far, and then we realize that we actually take a bunch of steps backward and we have to start over again. And that's sort of the human condition, right? So that's, I think, undergirding all of my comments is, and maybe some of the other comments, is that that's sort of where we are, and recognizing that, but also being willing to sort of grapple with that and continue to grapple with that is the gift and the pain of doing human rights work. So I just wanted to shift quickly to talk about my experience in the clinic. And my clinical experience was in some ways complicated because, I came to Harvard to, as I said, to work in this clinic, and I'm really glad that that's what I did. I had great colleagues and great advisors, and built some really wonderful relationships that were really important to me to kind of expand my thinking, but also to recognize ways that students and faculty here are just amazing. Like, people do really amazing work, and they are such critical thinkers, and it was important for me to be able to be in a space where I could do lots of hard work, but also be able to observe my colleagues and classmates in their awesomeness. And what I mean by their awesomeness is, I do think that I had the experience I had the experience of being basically, like, I think the only African American in my class who really was involved in the clinic in the way that I was, but also I was in a space where I could have conversations with people that were honest about what that means, what it means to sort of be in a place where most of the advocates don't look like the people on whose behalf they're advocating, and the ways that they're sort of grappling with those questions and thinking about those questions. The other thing that I really appreciated about being in the clinic was that I got to invest a lot of time here, and not just because I got to spend a lot of time in the offices, but because the projects I worked on, I was able to sort of be involved in from start to finish. And that meant a lot because it meant that, we've talked about building networks and building relationships with people on the ground and in local communities, and I was able to do that and really go back. I worked on the main project I worked on over the course of my time here took me to South Africa, and I was able to spend 2 years getting to know the people we worked with and interviewed, and building relationships with them, and really grappling with some of the challenges that came up in our research. And so, it could just be a function of this place having a lot of resources, but I also think it's a function of the willingness on the part of the faculty to invest in the relationships with local organizations and local people to kind of see things through, and that was a really important takeaway for me. So, thank you.
Chris.
Yeah. Hi, good morning. So before this workshop started, Jerry Newman, who was my professor in international human rights law, dropped by saying he couldn't make it because he has his class. I actually see him over there. And so I asked him, so how are you, Jerry? He said, I'm good. The world is in crisis, but all things considered, I'm good. And I said, Jerry, I am not going to talk about the world in crisis. I am going to talk about this, and I showed him my cheat sheet, and the top word is hope. And that's what I'm going to talk about. Not only because I think that's the response to the challenges to the human rights movement, but I think our failure to embrace that, not only at a psychological level, but at a tactical level, is causing some of the challenges we have at the human rights movement. So before I go into the hope part, I'm going to talk about the despair part, right? The way I see it, so we just finished like a 2-year research precisely on the challenges to the human rights movement, especially presented by populist governments and populist movements. Actually, here's that book. I'd love not to have to carry them back to Bogota, so if you can please grab a copy. My husband and I will be very grateful. So the two parts of that despair. The first one are the internal critiques or challenges within the human rights movement, right? And Meghan alluded to it, and some of the panelists alluded to it. They're old. The challenges or the allegations against the human rights movement by human rights practitioners ourselves is that first we're too technical. We use human rights jargon. We use the law in a way that we lose people, we lose communities, and you always hear this, we have to build constituencies, like an afterthought. But we've become technocrats at what we do for good reason, especially at the beginning of the human rights movement, during its flourishing after the Cold War, where international law and law in general was the tool to address some of the atrocities in the world. The second one is we're too detached. And by detached, not just to the public because of our being too technical, but also within the movement. You always hear this word silos, right? They're silos. So you have legal human rights organizations, NGOs like my organization, and how often do NGOs actually work with social movements? Or e-activists, individuals who don't even identify themselves as human rights people, they just want change, or they speak that language of social justice and not necessarily rights, or the UN Declaration of Human Rights. The third one is we're supposedly too old. By old, I don't mean age like Tyler referred to it, but age in too old in terms of our tactics. And there are two top tactics that we've been using in the human rights movement. The first one is naming and shaming, and that presents a problem at a time when governments have no shame.
Right.
Before a corruption scandal can bring down a government. Now Erdogan has had how many corruption scandals, and he's going strong. Orban in Hungary as well, and let's not even talk about the country we're in right now. And the second one is a law-centered discourse, or law as the tool. It is one of the powerful tools historically and until today, but many human rights organizations, especially lawyers, were trained, like what Meghan said, and we always think first about the law, when sometimes the law is not the response, especially at a time when governments love using the law, they love changing constitutions, they love passing legislative reforms, they love holding elections to do the opposite of what we want to do. The first thing, in the book we discuss some of like the common things in the playbook of populists. The first thing is you come to power, you change the constitution through a proper constitutional amendment process, right? You do an election to perpetuate yourself in power. So as lawyers, having law as our tool, and now governments are using the exact same tool we've been using to work against us, how do you grapple with that? The second part of the despair is precisely these governments. We try to focus on populist governments instead of authoritarian governments or dictatorships. Some call them competitive authoritarianisms or democracies without rights. We focus on populism, and by that I'm going to speak briefly by what we mean. And I think having that understanding of what we mean by populists and what they do or their nature allows us to respond more effectively to them. The first characteristic for us of populists is that they're anti-elitism. They speak using a moral claim of an elite that they're supposedly representing the real people against. So they frame that we are the real people. Everyone else who's not the real people are the others. And the definition of who the elite is very fluid. There's no objective definition to that. Here in the United States, Trump, who's a billionaire, calls himself as fighting the elite in DC, right? In Hungary, the elite would be the Muslim immigrants who are against the interests of Christian Hungarians, whose rights and interests are being threatened by the influx of immigrants across the border. In India, it would be the Muslim Indians who are threatening the life and the traditions of Hindu Indians. So there's that pitting of the elite versus the other. That's such a powerful narrative that I think we were not trained anywhere in our work to deal with, because we were taught to put out a report, a book, something like this. These are the facts, these are the legal arguments, this is the law, the violation of the law, and these are the solutions. The second one is this anti-pluralism of populists, meaning they're not against debate, they're not against elections, they like contests, but not genuine ones. And because their claim is a moral claim as to who the people is, there's no way that you can win against them. And understanding those two, I think, is key for us to really grapple with this big challenge of the human rights movement. Now, these two have caused this certain frame of peril and crisis that Jerry referred to before we started this morning. And it's everywhere. You see human rights reports. The titles are, I'll remember some. They're Global Civic Space Emergency, Democracy Under Siege, Democracy in Crisis, et cetera, et cetera. And they have factual basis for that. But using that frame of peril and crisis as the predominant frame causes us first to lose people outside of the movement, and second, to lose people within the movement. Within the movement, it causes depression within the human rights community when you feel like you work 20 hours a day, and you feel like the world is falling apart. I had that more than a year ago. I was at my office. I had a few difficult months. And then I was in the office and I had that light bulb moment after those months of reflection when I said, okay, I'm going to leave human rights. That's what I'm going to do. And that was caused by months of thinking, what impact am I making? The world is under siege. The world is falling apart. So what's the point, right? Well, I've come from the other side, right? I'm right here, and I'm a renewed human being. But that's one. And the second one is there's this fantastic blog by the head of brand of Amnesty International. His name is Thomas Coombs. The title of his blog was Hope, Not Despair, and why we should communicate hope instead of fear in human rights. And there are cognitive science studies that show that when you trigger fear in people, you cause them you trigger their base instincts of defense. So when people are fearful, especially when they read titles like that of The World Under Siege, they tend to be more defensive and more conservative. But when you make people feel safe and when they have joy, they tend to get in touch with the upstairs part of their brain that has to do with empathy and rational response. But how do you do that when we're trained to write reports that have titles of democracy and crisis, and we talk about violations and not so much about the victories or the life of a refugee rebuilding his or her life after being integrated into a community? We talk about refugee influx and violations and the terrible conditions, but not so much about joy, not so much about hope. There's this fantastic book by Catherine Sickink. If you haven't read it, I suggest you get it. It's entitled Evidence for Hope. And she says, we should have hope, but not because we should have hope, but there's data supporting that there is hope. She says that it's actually not true. She did a historical study, she did a statistical study showing that, in fact, we are at a much better place now in terms of human rights than before. There are many reasons why we think human rights is in crisis, that it's the end times of human rights. But in fact, if you look at it, there are less genocide today. The infant mortality rate is much lower. Our socioeconomic conditions in different parts of the world, of course with exceptions, are much better. But there are a number of reasons why we tend to focus on negative things. The first is, psychologically, we're wired to have bias for negative information, right? And the second one is we've pushed the goalpost. We've actually, for example, in domestic violence, expanded the definition of what domestic violence is. Necessarily, you will then have more cases of domestic violence reported, either because the definition is broader and perhaps because people know more on how to report cases of domestic violence. And she said that we should be careful in putting out there this frame of crisis and peril, because you can lose people within the movement and you can lose people outside the movement. So I'm going to go now to the part about hope, this frame of hope and renewal. And it's hope on the basis of fact and the basis of action. And with the clinic, so I've always been quite a reflexive person, but I think the clinic made it worse. And I took the course of Tyler and Susan on human rights advocacy and litigation, and one word I took away from that, I'm not sure I remembered everything else, was reflexivity. So the first human rights course I organized after my LL.M, I said, we have to have a module about reflexivity and human rights. So that course has been going on for 5 years now, and that module on reflexivity is still there, and that's your fault. So practicing my reflexivity today, I'm gonna leave with, I think, 3 things that the clinic has been doing a lot of, and I think it's something for us to think about in our daily work, which is, the first one is emotion, the second one is innovation, and the third one is collaboration. What do I mean by emotion? I said that we tend to talk in jargon and technical language, the right to this and that, which is important. I'm not discounting that at all. But often, the success of populist governments in getting so much public support is their ability to reach into people's emotions, into their values, the use of stories and narratives. Do we do that in our work? Do we work? Do we see our work as do we see ourselves as responsible for also reaching into what matters to people and not just what we think should matter? in that chapter, there are two beautiful examples, one from Hungary by the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union, and the second one is this caravan of love in India, where they really use this emotion and this values and stories to reach to people at a time when they are under siege. So the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union, you must know what's going on in Hungary. Viktor Orban just won a supermajority in the parliament, and his first legislative effort is the Soros package, which is a set of laws that is supposed to crack down against NGOs supported by George Soros, basically liberal NGOs, because he's saying that Soros is the devil. And so what they did was they were being attacked as foreign spies, paid mercenaries. These are really the terms that he uses in the media, not unlike what's going on now in the United States. So what HCLU did is to not respond to those attacks. They didn't go out there with a press release saying, we are not paid mercenaries. They didn't even repeat any of the words that were used against them or against civil society. Instead, they launched a campaign called #HCLUisNeeded. And doing that, what they did was they put out their stories, personal stories of their staff, of why they decided to work in human rights and why they decided to work at HLU. It really says, hi, I'm Chris, I'm this age, etc. I decided to work here because this and that. And they also put out their stories of their clients, not on their most controversial issues that are divisive, but on issues that most Hungarians can identify with, on disability, on pension, etc., saying, HCLU helped me this and that, to make people feel that human rights is for everyone, not just for minorities. It is for minorities and everyone in the community. They did not repeat the message. We were running a lab recently with International Network of Civil Liberties Organizations. ACLU was in the room, HLU was in the room, and there was a group that said, we're gonna launch a campaign where we're gonna do a march and we're gonna say, we are not terrorists. And then one of the experts in the room from Greenpeace is like, you realize by launching that campaign, you are repeating the message. That there's an allegation that you are terrorists. What HCLU did was to not repeat the message at all and tell their own story. They used stories. They talked to musicians, people with huge following in social media. They asked families to talk to their families and share on Facebook about HCLUisNeeded. And one day there was a protest at in front of the parliament in Hungary. They did not organize that protest, and people started chanting, HCLUisNeeded, HCLUisNeeded. So it got entrenched in people's imagination, the public imagination. It was beautiful. The other one in India is Harsh Mander, who was, for 10 years, the commissioner on the right to food case of the Supreme Court of India. So he's a lawyer, he's a jurist. There has been a surge in the case of public lynchings of Muslims in India. So what he decided to do, he wrote a blog, and then he called for a caravan to be done. They traveled from the east to west of India, entirely crowdfunded, all volunteer-based, to travel to the sites of lynching and talk to the families of those who were lynched and who were killed. And there was no talk of the law or any legal issue there. He was just there, and his colleagues were there to listen to the families and to put out that great symbolism of compassion and care in Indian society that is often lost because of this Hindu-Muslim divide. But the beautiful part as well with that is, after the caravan, he partnered with the Human Rights Law Network, and they started filing cases against those who were responsible for the lynching, and they just had their first legal victory. So the second one is innovation. We're taught in law school, and I love how it was repeated on none, and I was just talking to Tyler about the different initiatives in the clinic, about the lab, etc. I was trained as a lawyer. I never thought I'd be doing design thinking. Or I was sent to a training in Stanford, and I was like, okay, you're gonna learn about design thinking, and you're gonna start running labs using design thinking, scenario planning. I'm going to a training in Palo Alto on futures thinking. Because as a human rights advocate, you can't just know the law. You have to have all these tools, because you have to treat a problem as part, with systems thinking in mind. That means you have to have all the tools and all sorts of discipline that can help you approach a problem. The third one is collaboration, and I touched a bit about it on ecosystem. But collaboration with other fields, not just the law, within the law, with other fields, and also between the global north and global south. And I love, I know Thomas spoke a lot about it, and someone being someone from the Global South, that's also a daily struggle for me in a different way, which is how do I promote collaboration within the Global South? And how do I promote collaboration between the Global South and the Global North? Because we have so much that we can achieve together. And so that's a big chunk of my work now, which is this North-South collaboration.
I kind of feel like we should just stop now, but I think Tyler and I we had hoped to have time to speak with all of you about success and how we define success. I think for the sake of time, Tyler and I are just going to share a few closing thoughts about that to wrap it up. So, although I feel like we've done a wonderful job of kind of leaving on a high note, so we'll try to stay with that theme. One thing I wanted to say about success first is that I think we're doing a better job with self-care as people who do this kind of work. That's not really something that's come out today, but it's worth saying that when I started doing this work, people did not talk a lot about the toll that it takes on you. And now that's something that's embedded in our clinic and the way that we teach and train. It's something that I think more and more organizations are thinking about, and it's important because we've heard this is a very long game that we're playing, so we have to take care of ourselves if we're going to be sustainable. So to me, that's one important mark of success. I think another theme that's come out really clearly today is how much more collaborative we are and how the movement and human rights language and human rights tactics are becoming more diffuse. So yes, of course, there are still all of the criticisms that are very present about the kind of the dominance of the global north, but I feel that more and more organizations and individuals are taking kind of the approach that Thomas articulated, where we are in the background, where we are in a supporting role, where the old tactics, the naming and shaming, the litigation that Chris spoke about are kind of falling away and are replaced more and more with something that, again, we try to teach in the clinic, which is this community lawyering approach where we are in a supporting role, where we are working in partnership, and especially in a moment where we've heard a lot about the crisis that we're in. It seems like that is the only way forward, is to work collaboratively and to work in a supporting role. The final thing that I wanted to say is that when I was thinking about success, I had this realization that it feels to me like even when we're losing, we're winning. So part of that comes from being in this kind of crisis moment, which hopefully opens up more and more opportunities for us to think creatively and collaboratively. In the clinic, I mean that in the sense that even when we're losing, we are still training the next generation of students to be able to do this kind of work. So even if we don't have the outcome that we want on a particular project or on a particular case, I'm totally confident that the students who have been working on it have taken the lessons and will carry them forward. And especially listening to all of you and realizing that you all came through here and are now out in the world doing this kind of work, I'm like, oh, we really are winning. But the last piece of that brings me back to where Thomas started, which is the Momani case. I was looking back at an op-ed that I had drafted towards the end of the trial when I think many of us were concerned that we were going to lose, because you never know with the jury what the outcome will be. And I was looking at the points that I had made in that piece about the importance of the case, about the opportunity for the clients to tell their stories, about the defendants having to sit in court day in and day out and answer questions and answer for what they had done, about kind of reaffirming that US courts are a place where justice can be sought and maybe be found, about the shaming aspects of it. And all of these things that were so important were wins regardless of the outcome. So yes, it is wonderful and lovely that we won this case, but the value and kind of the success of it was in doing it. So I think that's where I want to kind of close in terms of success.
I don't know if I have much to add, so I'll try to be brief since we're right at 11:30. In thinking about the success, one of the things that I started with was that the law is really a struggle over power. And a lot of what we're doing is, yes, we want to achieve the rule of law, but a lot of success is actually when we make the law less oppressive. And kind of thinking about a success in negative terms was not where I wanted to start, but that's a lot of what my experience has been is either holding the line, pushing back on the oppression of the law, but the law not as a good thing, but as actually a place where the powerful and the privileged are using it to instill and entrench values that are not the ones that I hold close to my heart. And that's often what we're doing. I think that's why the doing is actually important, because the markers of a verdict that Thomas talked about, we need to celebrate, or working with colleagues who are able to be advisors to ICANN, which won the Nobel Peace Prize on, for its efforts to get a treaty to end nuclear weapons. Those moments need to be celebrated. We do. Those markers need to be the ones that we celebrate, pop the champagne, which we've done. But it's the smaller moments between them that hold it together for me. And part of what today and these last 2 hours have done for me is instilled or reaffirmed for me that there's so much collective knowledge in a room like this, and that's part of the moments. These 2 hours is a moment. And the way that this group that I know, and I've met Chris for the first time, but I'm bringing knowledge that he has brought to the table into this conversation for me. That collective knowledge is part of the success of what builds movements. That's the second thing for me. The other thing I think is that the first hour was about personal, the second hour was about movements. I think we can't disentangle the two. And often we talk about system change, but system change cannot be disconnected from the individuals. And every one of the people that spoke today had those connections. The way Thomas talked about, yes, this is the first, it's historic in the sense of holding a powerful person to account, but it starts with individuals. There's always the individual that roots us. And that connection has to be there and always is. And those successes, I've never seen a success where you have one without the other. The last piece for me is that this is a day of celebrating HLS in the community. And we've talked a lot about service in other settings, not as much today. But for me, as I thought about HLS in the community, I thought about this is a school. It's a law school. And we talk about teaching and training, but for me, a school is a place of learning. And that's what we do. That's what the collective knowledge is. And so for me, as I thought about what sustains me, this gets to the self-care, is that I feel so fortunate to be a learner every day in this school, to learn from Meghan, Chris, Thomas, Sam, and Susan. Susan, I get to do it every day with, almost every day, not weekends, but
a lot of weekends.
True. But also the colleagues I work with and the students. And I think I'll close with these thoughts, that so much learning comes from students every day that we work together. And over the last couple of days, this is kind of the bittersweet month of graduations coming. People are reflecting. There's lots of time to think about the last 3 years, but also looking forward. And 4 things came to mind. I'll close with this. One is that the students show me every day what it means to be an advocate by showing up. And they show up in our clinic, and they show up in spades. The hours they put in, the commitment they put in, that's the first success, is just showing up. The second is what Meghan said, is they bring their values to the table. So they show up, and they show up with their values about what they think the law can be, and they do that with their hearts, but also their minds. They combine the two together. They also help. The third thing is they help create memories, which I think is a real part of success, is they help create memories for me and hopefully for them. But those memories and what we do, and I can look at them and the ones that I've worked with closely over the last month, And I could probably point to each of them and say just one word, and it would trigger a memory for both of us. And I have that with colleagues too. The last piece is that because this is a school, I hope that we part with always remembering to learn from each other and the communities we work with. So we thank you for today and the discussion, and celebrate the rest of the day. It's sunny today.